good evening, everyone, and welcome. We are so glad that you joined us tonight as we sit down with Charlie Lovett. We are very excited to share that we are joining you live from campus in the 900 room, so hopefully many of you have fond memories here, as I know Charlie does. Before we get started, just a couple of reminders. If you have questions for Charlie throughout the event, please place those questions in the Zoom chat to all panelists. We have many questions that were submitted ahead of time, but please don't hesitate to add additional questions, and we will answer as many as we can throughout the evening. A final reminder, I'm sure that most of you have finished reading the Bookman's Tale, but we might have some spoilers during the discussion. So this is your final warning. If you haven't finished reading it, there may be some spoilers. So we are so thrilled to have Charlie with us this evening. Charlie was born in Winston-Salem, North Carolina in 1962 and grew up as the child of a book collecting English professor. He graduated from Davidson in 1984 and later received his MFA in writing from Vermont College in 1997. His breakthrough fiction writer came when he combined two of his passions, rare books and the English countryside, to write the Shakespearean mystery, The Bookman's Tale, which is a New York Times bestseller. And it is guaranteed to capture the hearts of book lovers, and it certainly did that. Charlie, thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Great. Well, we're just going to jump right in because we've got lots of questions. So to get us started, can you talk a little bit about what inspired you to write The Bookman's Tale?
Sure. I can actually remember the day that this novel started. My family and I were traveling in England. We were up in Yorkshire, and the most recent Harry Potter book had just come out. And we only had 2 copies amongst 4 of us, so we were kind of passing it around. And when it was not my turn, I went out to take a walk, and I was thinking about what I wanted to write next. And I was thinking about the last time I'd been in Yorkshire. A friend of mine had taken me to this chapel that was next to this kind of abandoned house where the people were living in trailers in the garden, but not in the house. And the chapel had really cool stuff in it. And I started thinking, yeah, maybe a chapel with cool stuff in it. And that was really the beginning. And that was, I took a lot of notes that day and wrote down a lot of ideas, but the only thing that stayed in the book was there's a chapel that has a hidden secret in it. And then I think I hit on the idea of I'm a book collector. I was an antiquarian bookseller. I've always liked books and rare books. And wouldn't it be interesting to write a novel that, incorporated that interest? And then my wife and I had spent time living in this little village of Kingham in the English countryside. So Kingham came into the book and it all started to come together.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I remember the scene with the chapel is one of my favorite parts of the book. So this audience had a lot of questions about whether or not Davidson had any inspiration for the setting or any of the characters. So can you talk a little bit about the influence that Davidson may have had?
Sure. I mean, Davidson had a big influence on me. It's important to note that when I wrote this book, I was not an established writer of novels. And so I was just pulling all sorts of different things from my life, things that might be interesting to the 4 or 5 people who I thought maybe might one day read this book. So when I created Ridgefield University, this fictional university where Peter Byerly is an undergraduate, it was kind of modeled on multiple different North Carolina universities. So I grew up as a faculty child at Wake Forest. The library at Ridgefield is definitely modeled on the Wake Forest Library. And the Wake Forest Library, I used to hang out there on Saturday mornings, and go and read old Life magazines and things. And it was all very sort of metal shelves and industrial feeling, except there was this one door that said rare books. And there was this little bitty window in the door. And if you peeked through the window, you saw this room with like beautiful wooden bookcases and lush carpets on the floor and everything. And I thought, ooh, I want to go in there. I want to be in that room. So that was where the library came from. But the campus itself, to me, was always Davidson. I always pictured Peter and Amanda wandering around Davidson. Now, they were at Davidson in 1984, so the College Union was in a different part of campus where it is now. It was where the music department is now. So with the scene where they meet in the snack shop at the College Union, I had probably somewhere on the order of 1 million meals in that snack shop during my time at Davidson. And when I remember coming back to talk at Davidson not long after the book was published, and we were in Chambers, in a classroom in Chambers, and I pointed out the window and I said, that tree right outside that window is where Peter used to kiss Amanda goodnight every night. So to me, the layout of the campus was definitely Davidson.
Absolutely. I'm sure many of us pictured Davidson while we were reading it. Any characters?
So there are no characters in the book that are like as characters based on people that I knew, but there are two people whose names and a little bit about their physical appearance were based on people that I knew at Davidson. So one is the librarian, my fictional librarian, Francis Leland, is a little tip of the hat to Leland Park, who was the librarian when I was here at Davidson. It was just such a wonderful, wonderful gentleman. And then Hank Christensen, I think is the name. It's been a while since I've read the book, so forgive me if I get anything wrong. Hank Christensen, who runs the restoration lab, he's a little tip of a hat to a guy named Eric Christensen, who was the head of the campus tech crew, which I worked on when I was here. And Eric, a friend of mine once said, Eric looked a little bit like a Muppet. He had this long blonde hair, this big blonde beard, and these little round glasses. And so Hank looks a little bit like Eric looked.
Great. We had several questions about your writing process. So can you describe what that looks like for you? So
it's a little different for every book. But the general process for me in writing a novel is, I see there's sort of three main stages in the crafting of a novel. So the first stage, it doesn't look like anything's happening because I'm just thinking about stuff. And maybe I'm writing things down. I mean, my wife knows not to throw away any envelopes or scraps of paper that have things written on them because it might be the next brilliant idea for a novel, you know. But I will just be thinking about story, but mostly thinking about character, thinking about who do I want to inhabit this next novel. And I'll start writing little character sketches and learning about who these people are and how they might react to different situations, and gradually starting to think about what might happen to them. And that process can go on for a couple of years sometimes, and certainly several months. And then the next process is when I've got a pretty good handle on who the characters are and on at least the rough arc of the story, then it's time to sit down and write the first draft. A lot of times I start seriously working on a first draft after I have 10 or 20,000 words that I've kind of put together slowly. But when I get really serious about, okay, yes, there's a book here. Yes, it's time for me to write a rough draft. And this was certainly the case with Bookman's Tale. That's when I get really disciplined. I try to write, I don't try to write, I do write 10,000 words a week. I don't think of that as a goal. I just think of that as my job. Like if you're a surgeon, you're not allowed to say, well, it's my goal to finish this surgery, but I got surgeon's block today, so I'm not going to be able to finish, you know. So I don't think in my job I should be able to do that either. So that's the part where it takes real discipline, is banging out the rough draft. And that could be, you know, 2 or 3 months. And then you have a first draft. And then that's when the real work starts. That's when you start to look and say, okay, what story am I telling here? And what within this draft is contributing to that story and what's taking away from it? And what does my wife think? What does my agent think? What does my editor think? And you go through lots of rewriting based on input from other people, eventually to get to, you know, the final draft of the novel.
For the writers out there that are tuning in, do you have any tips for when you experience that writer's block?
Well, don't name it. Like, that's what I do. I just don't use that term. If you don't believe that it's a thing, maybe that'll help keep it away. And I will say that it is, I don't want to pretend that it's a completely false thing, but sometimes writer's block is just, I'm feeling kind of lazy. You know, sometimes it's, I don't want to sit down and do the hard work of thinking, because when we just sit in a chair and think, it doesn't look like we're doing anything. There's so much pressure in our society to like produce tangible results. And like, what did you do today? I sat in a chair for 6 hours and thought, or I went on a long walk and thought. That doesn't seem like work. But in writing a novel, it's a really important part of the work. And I think that's the part that helps prevent the writer's block. I don't start to write a first draft until I know I have a good idea. I know I have good characters. I know I have some place for those characters to go. I don't know necessarily everything about every step along the way, or even exactly where they're going to end up. But I have enough before I start so that I have those tools to prevent me from getting blocked, you know.
Thank you. That's very good advice. Do you have books or authors that you enjoy reading most, and why?
Oh gosh, there's so many. I mean, so there are books and authors who have been influential to me in my career as a writer and just in my career as a reader. I was asked this question by the Sydney, Australia Morning Post. I was supposed to come up with 5 books that were important in my life. And one of them I read while I was a student at Davidson. It was summertime. And I read The World According to Garp. It was my introduction not only to John Irving, but it was kind of my introduction to contemporary fiction. It was the first time I had read like a grown-up novel that had not been assigned to me by a professor or by a teacher. And that was really eye-opening, that I could just like read a novel for my own entertainment. It wasn't a children's book. It wasn't for school. It was just a book. And so John Irving is certainly one that I admire. A.S. Byatt, I'm a huge fan of. I mean, Possession is one of my favorite books ever. I love it when when A.S. Byatt's name appears in the same review as mine, even if it is to say, Charlie Lovett could never be anywhere near as good as A.S. Byatt. I'm like, that's great. I love being, even mentioned in the same sentence. But I'm discovering new writers all the time. I have a podcast where I interview other writers, and it's great for me because sometimes I get to say, oh, this is one of my favorite people. I want to interview Louise Penny, or I want to interview Ian McEwan. But other times it's who's available, and I get introduced to new authors and new types of writing that I might not have seen otherwise. So I try to read pretty widely when I'm just reading novels. The other type of reading is, okay, I'm working on a book. I'm writing a book that's set in 1906 New York. Now I've got a really specific kind of research reading that I'm doing. That's a whole different ballgame.
Right, right. Well, I think we would all add Charlie Lovett to our list of favorite authors moving forward. Okay, so now we are going to talk a little bit about the Bookman's Tale.
Okay.
So how did you identify the themes for this story and weave them together?
Well, you guys all read the book. What do you think the themes are? Put it in the chat. Then I can tell you how I identified them. Especially with this book being my first, it wasn't the first time I'd written something that was the length of a novel, but I think it's pretty fair to say that it was my first novel. There was probably more discovering in the process than in some of my other books. I always have a lot of discovering in the process, but for this book, there was a lot of it. I discovered very early on, I wrote that first scene first, and without really thinking very much about it, I made Peter a widower. And what I didn't realize was that it was going to become a book about grief, about how we handle grief, about how we can be sidelined by grief, and about how eventually we can get back into our lives. It doesn't mean that the grief ever leaves us, but we can live again. And I think to me, that was probably the biggest theme of this novel. I was probably subconsciously, later on, I was consciously influenced by my father. My father lost his first wife when she was 29 years old, and he was 30, I think. And that was a grief that he carried with him for his whole life, but he didn't let it define the rest of his life. He still lived a really full life and had a 53-year-long second marriage and wonderful children and everything else. And so I was really aware of this idea that when we're scarred, the scars are there always, but they don't have to be the only thing that defines who we are. And I wanted Peter to figure out how to realize that for himself. The original title of the book was Marginalia. That's the title that I wrote it under, which is, as you know, if you've read the book, these are the little writings in the margins of a book. But I liked it metaphorically too, because I feel like Peter is living on the margins of life at the beginning of the book. And at the end of the book, he's learned to sort of move back into the text of his own life. My publisher decided that if we only wanted to sell the book to a handful of rare book librarians, that would be a great title, but that maybe other people might want to read the book too. So to me, I think that, other than obvious things, we're playing with forgery and rare books and all the sort of things that are more on a plot level, to me on the thematic level, it's a book about the arc of this character who begins at a place of very, very deep grief that has almost immobilized him. And he by going back to the things that he's passionate about, because the subtitle of the book is a novel of obsession, which I did not come up with that subtitle. That's why I had to look to see what it was. But I started thinking about, okay, what is obsession, when the publisher came up with that subtitle. And I think in this book, obsession is passion free from moral compass. Peter has a lot of passions that he falls back on in his grief and that help him back into his life. Other people in the book have passions that drive them to do things that are perhaps not morally correct. And so that's when it becomes obsession. I think Peter's right on that line, but other characters do things that sort of fall in over that. So to me, it was about a man who uses his passions to find a way back from this crippling grief that he is experiencing.
Yeah. We have one reader who has asked, why did Amanda have to die so early in the story?
Well, okay. So we know on page 1 that Amanda's going to die, right? Because it says Peter is a widower, or Peter, and we know on about page 3 that she died 9 months before this scene that we're having. And so that meant I had to kill her off. I mean, I'm sorry, but that's, I can't write a book about grief if nothing bad happens. But I will say this, because we were talking about this in the elevator on the way up. When the last time I read this book, when it was still a pile of pages and not bound in covers. So the last edit. So I'd written the book, I'd rewritten it and then edited it many times. I'd read through it, who knows how many times. But the last time I read through it, I try to read at the end of a major edit, I try to sit down and read the book all the way through in one day if I can, because it helps me see the flow of the book, and it helps me be sure that there's not inconsistencies, and that it sort of, just kind of works as a whole, to be able to hold the whole thing in my head in one day. And so that can be an emotionally tiring day. And the day I did this with this book, when I got to the scene where Amanda died, I was literally this close to just hurling the whole stack of papers across the room. I was so upset. And then I was able to kind of step away from that for a second and realize, if having read this book so many times and knowing better than anybody in the world that these are made up people, if I am feeling this emotionally connected to what happens to one of these people, that's probably a good sign. I've probably done something right as a writer, because maybe somebody else will feel emotionally connected too. And I will warn you, I have other books where characters that people love die even earlier in the book, and readers get really angry at me. So, if you can't handle that, you might want to back away from at least one other Charlie Lovett book that I can think of. Yes.
Well, we do have lots of questions about characters. So do you have a favorite character from the Bookman's Tale, or a character that you find particularly interesting?
Well, I mean, the Bookman's Tale probably has a more clear-cut protagonist than any other book I've written. I mean, First Impressions has 2 protagonists in 2 different timelines. One of them is Jane Austen, and one of them is a modern-day young woman. I feel like The Lost Book of the Grail has 2 protagonists. I feel like Escaping Dreamland has 4 protagonists. So Peter is clearly the protagonist of the Bookman's Tale. So I think just because I spend more time with him than with any other character, I probably feel more closely connected to him than any other character. That's different from saying that Peter is based on me. I get this question a lot, is Peter based on you? And we did an event in Kingham, the village where the book is set. The Bookman's Tale is very big in the little book groups around the villages near Kingham. And so we did an event in Kingham, and about 60 or 75 people showed up in a village of 750 people. And I thought, wow, if we could get that many people, if I do an event in New York and we get the same percentage, that would be awesome. We'd sell out Madison Square Garden. But somebody asked, is Peter Byerly based on you? And I said, oh no, he's completely different from me. I don't have an anxiety disorder, blah, blah, blah. And as we were walking back home, our neighbor and very dear friend who lives right around the corner from us in Kingham, turned to me and she said, Charlie, I think Peter's a lot more like you than you think. And it was very interesting to hear that from somebody looking at me. So I started to think about it. I think Peter and I, obviously, on the surface, yes, we both love rare books. We're both, went to a school that's pretty much like Davidson. But I also think we're both romantics at heart. I think Peter, for all of his loss, he still believes in love. And he always did believe in that. And I think Peter and I are alike in that way. So yeah, Peter's certainly the character, but there are other characters that, I really like Frances Leland. I like Amanda. I like Liz. I like how different Amanda and Liz are. I wanted there to be a real contrast between those 2 characters, because when we're attracted to a person, when we fall in love with a person, there's rarely a logic to it. And I wanted that to be clear, that Peter doesn't really have a type, So yeah, I feel like I have to like my characters on some level to be able to spend that much time with them. So most of them, in some way or other, I like them. Yeah.
You've mentioned several of the characters, and there are so many. So we have a question. Did you ever lose track of them? How did you keep up with them when they all have such intricate lives?
So, no, I didn't lose track of them, because, I think if you have a circle of 20 friends, and they're really, really good friends, then you remember who they are. You remember their names. And for the time I was working on this book, these were my 20 best friends, right? You know, they were the people I was hanging out with several hours every day. But I did ultimately, the last thing we did when we were editing this book is my editor came to me and she said, I feel like you've got these 3 different timelines. I feel like you're shifting back and forth between timelines too frequently. We need the readers to feel more grounded in one timeline before you switch to the other one. Now, on the surface, that seems like an easy thing to fix. You just combine scenes and, you know, done and done. But it's not that easy to fix because this book has so many interconnections between what's going on in one time period and what's going on in another time period. Peter's learning about forgeries from Francis Leland, and then forgery is happening in the historic timeline, and you know, and then in the present timeline, he's trying to figure out if this book is a forgery, things like that. So there's all these little interconnected things, and there's places where the reader has to find out information in a certain order for it to work. So ultimately what I did, and this is a little bit off topic, but this is how I kept track of things, is I wrote each scene, I summed up in a single sentence. And I put each one of those sentences on a slip of paper. And I had just built myself a new office that has a pool table in the middle of it, which I very rarely play pool on. And this is the reason I laid out all the slips of paper on the pool table and started doing it like a jigsaw puzzle. It was like this, like logic/jigsaw puzzle to figure out how can I arrange these 75 or 80 scenes in a way that takes care of the issue that my editor is raising, but still maintains the integrity of the text in the way that I see it.
Do you still have all those slips of paper?
I do not have all those slips of paper anymore. No, but I still do that. I still will. I mean, not necessarily to that extent, but sometimes to that extent. I've even done that with nonfiction books. You know.
That's a good way to do it. Yeah. You have most likely been asked this before, but are you an Oxfordian or a Stratfordian?
It's boring. I'm a Stratfordian. I believe that, along with Sherlock Holmes, that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. I also think that for William Shakespeare of Stratford not to have been the author of his plays would have required a cover-up of such monumental proportions that it's difficult. I mean, including members of the royal household, people like the Master of the Queen's Rebels would have had to been in on it. You know, it's just hard for me to believe that nobody would have you know, given away the plot. You know, that no Elizabethan would have gone to TMZ or tweeted or one of those sorts of things, that whatever, you know, the Elizabethan equivalent of those things, had this been this great grand secret. So, and so that's why I wrote the book the way that I wrote the book, because there's all these other books that are written about where the big surprise in the book is Shakespeare wasn't Shakespeare. And I thought, well, what if the big surprise in the book is Shakespeare was Shakespeare? I think actually maybe more people would like that. And the response that I've had from at least English teachers has indicated that, yeah, a lot of people like that. So
I'm convinced. What motivated your decision to reveal the original Pandasto at the end of the book as opposed to leaving it destroyed?
Okay. Well, I don't know what motivated me, but I think it was a good decision. I'm going to have to defend the way the book ends. After I had written this book, I went to a screenwriting conference in Los Angeles. My wife was like, you should go to this, it'll be fun. And it was really fun. I was the only person out of 2,000 people at this conference who wasn't trying to sell a screenplay. So I was like super relaxed while everybody else was really tense, you know. And at lunchtime, they would have an unannounced speaker in the big hall. And like, you know, it would be somebody who wrote for a TV show or who was a screenwriter or something. And one day, usually they just sort of talked about their career, but one day it was the guy, I can't remember his name, he wrote Little Miss Sunshine. And he delivered a prepared class called, pardon my French, How to Write a Kick-Ass Ending. And he looked at 3 films. He looked at Little Miss Sunshine, The Graduate, and the very first Star Wars movie, A New Hope, and explained how the perfect ending, a good novel has stakes in 3 different levels. You have personal stakes. So for Peter, the personal stakes at the end of the novel are, am I going to get out of this alive? You know, and is my friend going to get out of this alive? Then you have sort of community stakes, which would be like, am I going to save this Shakespearean artifact and preserve this special piece of history? And then you have sort of universal stakes, which is basically what's going to win, good or evil, good guys or bad guys. So in Star Wars, it's like, is Luke going to get shot? Or is the Death Star going to blow up the planet? Is the Rebel Alliance going to triumph over the Empire? All 3 of those things. And he showed us how in Star Wars, he said the best endings are when you have completely lost on all 3 levels, and then there's a turnaround and you win on all 3 levels, okay? So in Star Wars, he showed how that happened in 22 seconds. From the moment that Darth Vader says, "I've got you now," until they blow up the Death Star, 22 seconds, right? In the Bookman's Tale, it takes about 4 pages. Because there's a moment there where, and these are the spoilers, where you're convinced that Peter and Liz are going to be killed, that the book is going to be, destroyed or buried, and that history is going to be lost, and that the bad guy is going to win. And then it all gets turned around. So if we didn't preserve the real Pandasto, then we wouldn't really win in that middle level. Now, this is all retrospective for me because I'd already done it just on gut. But when I looked back at it after I took this class, I realized I did exactly what he was instructing me to do. That's the funny thing about storytelling. If you tell enough stories, you end up doing the things they teach you in the classes, even though you don't realize you're doing them, because that's just the way we tell stories, So yeah, plus I'm a rare book man. I couldn't have that be destroyed. What an awesome book that would be. Book collectors would have come up and berated me and hit me over the head with first folios and things if I had done that, so.
That's great. Thank you. We have some questions coming in through the chat. Thanks to our live audience. If you have more questions, please put them in the chat. So why did Peter steal the painting of Isabel and not pay for it?
That's a really good question. So this goes back to our discussion about obsession is passion free from moral compass, right? This is the point where Peter has 2 obsessions in his life. He flat out says this at one point, I think. His 2 obsessions are books and Amanda. At least up until the point that the novel begins, those have been his 2 obsessions. And he has, up to this point, managed to have passion free from moral compass. And so it's just been passion and not obsession, perhaps. But this is the point at which his passion for Amanda is so overwhelming that it pushes him into obsession. It pushes his moral compass somewhere off of true north. And, I had been in so many bookstores and seen so many things fall out of books. And then as a book dealer, I remember one time buying a set of Winston Churchill books, and the guy was like, disappeared. And then much later, after I discovered 2 original Winston Churchill letters in the books that I didn't know were there. And I couldn't go back to the guy and say, wait, I need to pay you more money because he was gone, So I liked this idea of the hidden treasures in old books. But I also like the idea of sort of pushing Peter's moral compass a little bit. If a character is just like 100% moral, they're not as interesting as if they're making decisions. And I want there to be places where the reader's going, no, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. And they do it anyway. The reader's sort of pulling their hair out. And I like those moments. As a reader, I like those moments. And as a writer, I like those moments. I know I'm going to have Peter end up in a place that I hope the reader will be happy with. But that doesn't mean the reader has to be happy with every step he takes along the way. And so I'm happy if a reader goes, oh, I wish he hadn't done that. Oh, or even I think less of him because of that. But also, you want the reader to see through Peter's eyes and see that he sees this thing on the floor and it incapacitates him, this image. He can't not pick it up and walk away with it. But he also can't go up to that guy and say, I want to buy this. Because he can't talk about it. He can't, he just needs to get out of that store and get home and figure this thing out,
Peter is such a great character, and the readers really love him. And they're curious, would you ever consider a new adventure for Peter, or a new love, or a new mystery to solve?
Well, it's funny you should ask that. So I have a new book coming out next fall. Right now, it's called The Enigma Effect, but I'm smart enough as a writer to know that may not be necessarily what it's called in the long run. I wanted to write more of a straight thriller. And so The Enigma Effect is a thriller in which the protagonist, who is a small town North Carolina librarian, is being shot at in the first scene while she's in her kitchen making something she saw on the British Bake Off last night, And so it starts out, like a thriller starts out. And it's your basic small town librarian teams up with professional assassin to solve 75-year-old Nazi mystery story. Yeah, I know, we've all read a million of these books, right? But there is a strand of the book in which there are some questions that a art history teacher at a small North Carolina college has about a rare book that's come into her possession. And so she goes to the guy in town who knows the most about rare books to talk to him about it. And it's this guy named Peter Byerly. Now, this book is set about 20 years after The Bookman's Tale. And Peter's not a major character, but he does show up. He has 2 or 3 scenes and some conversations, and we get to see where he is in his life at that point. I had been asked, write a sequel, we want to see Peter be the star of another book. And one of the reasons I didn't do that is because a good story is about characters who encounter obstacles, and they either overcome those obstacles or they don't overcome those obstacles. And we probably mostly learned that in our 4th grade reading class, that's what stories are about. I put a lot of obstacles in front of Peter Byerly. He's been through a lot. I did not have it in my heart to put another 250 pages worth of obstacles in front of this poor guy. Let's leave him alone, poor man, But next September, whatever the title of the book is, you'll at least find out what Peter Byerly is up to 20 years after The Bookman's Tale.
Okay, giving your explanation of the ending, did you consider having the folio destroyed in order to play with people's thinking about Shakespeare? Or did it end that way because of your predilection to Shakespeare?
Yeah, I think probably the second. I hate to answer a yes or no question, an either or question by just going that one, but they worded the question so well. Yeah, I think from the beginning I wanted it to be, we've proved that Shakespeare is really Shakespeare, and we found this really, really cool rare book. Again, as a rare book person, one of the really fun challenges in this book was to invent a rare book that was believable, significant, would mean something to people who were not book collectors. You could point out some sort of cultural significance to it beyond just it's a rare book, and that would sort of fit into a cultural spot and would accomplish something. That was really fun to try to figure out, and I didn't want it to be something obvious. The Pandasto is not a book that most people have heard of. The play that it inspired is not a play that most people have seen. It's not one of the famous Shakespeare plays that everybody reads. People don't read Winter's Tale in high school English class that often. I'm sure somebody's going to text and say, "Yes, I did." But having gone to all this trouble of creating this fictional rare book, I wanted it to burst upon the scene and be as cool for the fictional world that it was in as it was for the readers who were reading the book. And have them feel like that the journey of that book was as much of a character arc as Peter's journey in a way. And so for that, I wasn't going to then kill off the book at the end.
Right, right. I loved the love between Peter and Amanda. Was that based on a real relationship or inspired by a real relationship?
No, it was not. But I wanted them to be very different people. I think when Peter comes to Davidson College around the same, Ridgefield University, but we all know, right? When Peter comes to Ridgefield, about the time that I came to Davidson College in the early 1980s, he's pretty naive about the ways of the world. He's pretty naive about love. He doesn't even realize that he has a social anxiety disorder, because in those days we almost didn't have the language to describe that. And Amanda is in many ways his opposite. She is confident. She is a woman of the world in a way that very few college students were at the time. I mean, she kind of, she dresses nicely, and she sits up straight in the library, and I didn't know anybody who did that in college. No offense to any of my classmates who may be watching, but so I like the idea of taking two characters whose experience prior to meeting was very different, but who nonetheless, to just be corny and quote Tom Cruise, completed each other. Each of them made the other one a better person. And to me, that's the best kind of relationship, is if you make the other person a better person. And so in that sense, sure, it's based on lots of relationships, because all the best ones are like that. But it was not specifically based on any relationship. And may I say that any activities that they engaged in after dark in the library never happened at Davidson College. Let's just put that out there right now.
For a book such as The Bookman's Tale, how much time do you spend writing versus researching?
Oh, that's a great question. It's so hard to pull that out, because while there is some research that I did sort of before that big push to write the first draft, I read some books about William Shakespeare. I mean, my life as an antiquarian bookseller was research for this book in many ways. But I did a lot of book-specific research. There's also so much research that you do in the moment. There's so many moments where you get to, especially when you're writing a historical novel, and you go, okay, it's 1860. This guy is upper middle class. He lives in the countryside. A vehicle that's pulled by horses is going to take him to the train station. What is it called? And that's like an hour and a half out of my day right there to figure out what, so it's really impossible to sort of extricate the one from the other because they happen concurrent with one another as these little individual problems come up. So there's the background research that I do, that how long I honestly can't tell you how long it took with Bookman's Tale, because so much of it was just what I lived. Because I was drawing on my own experience as an antiquarian book seller and also as a book collector. And then there's the book-specific research that I did, which was reading about Shakespeare. And again, drawing on my own experiences, having studied Shakespeare, having performed in Shakespeare. And then finally, this sort of in-the-moment research that you do as you go along, especially for a historical book. And essentially all of this book was historical because I was writing it in 2010 or something like that. And the most recent part of it was set in 1995. So, it's almost harder to write a historical part of a book in the recent past than it is in the far past. I mean, how many of you remember what year it was when you didn't have a flip phone anymore and you had a smartphone, or what year it was that you got this app or that app? Like, these are the things that we novelists who are writing scenes that take place in 2005 sit up late at night and worry about, But yeah, so the research and the writing are really kind of very interconnected in a historical novel for me.
It's interesting. Yeah. We're jumping back a minute to Peter and Amanda.
Yeah.
Did you use the apparitions of Amanda as a way for Peter to accept his emotional thoughts, such as feelings for Liz, as a way for him to say this is what Amanda would want?
So the appearances of Amanda, wow, when I wrote that, it just felt like the right thing to write. I don't know, it's kind of hard to explain. I didn't really think too much about what it meant in the moment that I was writing it the first time. Well, then you go back and you rewrite and you start to think a little bit about it. And I was like, well, maybe this is just Peter's psyche. I don't know, maybe it's really a ghost. Am I writing magical realism? I'm not really sure. And about 2 months before the book was published, I can remember the street I was driving down. I was driving down the road and I was listening to an interview on NPR with Oliver Sacks, who had just written a book about hallucinations. And he said he said two things. He said, first of all, a true hallucination, if we're using the term correctly, the person who's having it cannot distinguish it from reality when it's happening. Maybe afterwards they can, but when it's happening, they can't. And the second thing he said is the most common type of hallucination is hallucinating the presence of a recently deceased loved one. Well, I almost ran my car off the road because I was like, that's what it is. I didn't know when I was writing it, but that's what it is. So because I didn't know that when I wrote it, for readers, it can be whatever you want it to be. If you think it's a ghost, if you think it's a hallucination, if you think it's his imagination, if he's just saying it to himself, it can be whatever. But Oliver Sacks thinks that it was a hallucination.
It seems that your male characters are seduced by women rather than vice versa. Would you say that's true?
Wait, by women rather than by?
It seems that your male characters are seduced by women rather than vice versa.
Oh, rather than vice versa. I think that's probably because of certainly Peter's naivete, but I think you're probably thinking about Peter and then also Philip Gardner, who's seduced by Isabella. But I think he probably has a naivete too. I mean, he has this idea that I painted these watercolors. Why won't you let me into the Royal Watercolor Society? They're watercolors. Anybody can look at them and see. And there's a certain childishness to him and sort of, pig-headedness that to me indicates a certain level of innocence and naivete. And those two women certainly seem to be in different ways, but are very much women of the world. And we find out later on why they're similar, don't we? Because they're related to each other. But they are the more mature people in the relationship. I think it would be fair to say in many ways. And I don't know why I chose to do that. I mean, maybe it's a certain self-consciousness about writing as a man. You don't want to come off making it look like you're trying to say that men are all that. Maybe it's looking around at relationships between young people that I see in this day and age and seeing very clearly that if there's an emotional parity, generally it's the man's a lot older because it's taken him a lot longer to get to that maturity level than it has taken the woman. I don't know. I'm not, sometimes when you're just in the moment and you're writing, you don't think about why you did it. And you never think about why you did it until you're sitting in front of a camera and somebody says, "Why did you do it?" And you're like, "That's a great question. I wonder why I did it." I mean, a lot of storytelling is, we just make this stuff up. It comes to us. And sometimes in the editing process, we're seriously questioning parts of it. But that was a part of it that never got questioned in the editing process. And so I never kind of went back and really delved in and thought, what was I thinking? What was I trying to do there? I was telling a story, and that dynamic interested me. It did interest me to have the same dynamic in both of those relationships, because I like the idea of this book being told across the centuries, where at least one of the things that we see is, some things are always the same. Books and stories are always important. Love is always important. There are some things that no matter what century we're in, there's a rock there.
That's great. Thank you. Has a fragment of the Pandasto been found?
Well, I mean, we know the text of the Pandasto. I mean, it exists. I mean, I think the first edition doesn't exist in a complete copy, but later editions do exist in multiple copies. So the printed text we know, but there's not been any fragment that has Shakespearean annotations on the side of it. I'm waiting for somebody to come up with that. That would be nice.
We have more questions coming in through the chat. We have about 15 minutes left, so if you have questions, make sure you place them in the chat for Charlie. Okay, so we know names hold special significance, and one of the readers shared that his grandfather cast the tie-breaking vote to name Wake Forest University. So how did you decide on the name Ridgefield for the college in the Bookman's Tale?
I will say that Ridgefield was more Wake Foresty in earlier drafts. I mean, I had the library being named after a young aviator, which the Wake Forest Library is the Z. Smith Reynolds Library, named after the young aviator, and some things like that. So it was a little bit more obviously a takeoff on it. And so I wanted it, I just wanted a word that's kind of sounded like a university. It's kind of like when you're naming housing developments, you just take two landscape words and you shove them together, ridge and field, and it just kind of seemed to work. And I like this idea that it was up on a hill. There was just something like that, especially the library being sort of the beacon on the hill. It seemed to me sort of symbolic of what colleges and universities can be at their best. A beacon of not just knowledge, but of wisdom. I think it says when you go into the library in Ridgefield, it says something like, "May this be a place of not only of knowledge, but of wisdom." And to me, like, being up on the hill, being on the ridge sort of exemplified that,
We have a reader who has asked, did you read Tom Swift and the Hardy Boys as a kid?
So is it okay if I pick up this book right now real quickly? Okay, so my current novel, Escaping Dreamland, comes out in paperback. It's out in hardback now, but it comes out in paperback next month. And it is all about the world of early 20th century children's series books. So yeah, I totally read, I mostly read the Hardy Boys. I didn't read as much Tom Swift, maybe one or two. But that world fascinated me. And when I found out secrets about how they're not secrets, but you may not know them, about how those books were created, when I found out that Franklin W. Dixon and Carolyn Keene and Victor Appleton weren't real people, I thought, somebody's got to write a novel about all of this. And that was the beginning of Escaping Dreamland. So, yeah.
We have a question here about Kingham, and you still have a cottage in Kingham, is
We
that
do,
correct?
yeah. We haven't been there since 2019, but,
Hopefully soon.
Hopefully soon, yeah.
Has the publication of the Bookman's Tale caused an uptick of visitors to Kingham?
There's been a huge uptick of visitors to Kingham since the Bookman's Tale came out. I would love to be able to take credit for that, but it's really because there's this massive thing called the Daylesford Organics that's about a mile away from us. It's this incredible farm shop and cottages and organic foods and cheeses and winery and everything else sort of. But I think that's had a little bit more impact in the publication of the Bookman's Tale. But every now and then, because our cottage is rented out as a holiday cottage when we're not there, every now and then I will get an email from somebody who's rented the cottage and said, oh, while we were there, your book was on the shelf, and I took it off and I read it. It was so lovely to read a book that was set in the village where I was having my holiday. So, it's kind of nice to think of people once in a while reading the Bookman's Tale in Kingham, even after all this time.
Yes, I think we are now all thinking about renting it. You told us a little bit about some of your future projects, but any more detail you'd like to share about what concepts you are considering for future books?
So I actually have 3 books coming out next year. The reason I have 3 books coming out in 1 year is largely due to COVID delays on 2 of them. But one of them is an academic study called Lewis Carroll Formed by Faith, which is a religious biography of Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, that's coming out from University of Virginia Press. And yes, I was briefly a religion major at Davidson before I became a theater major, so I consider myself qualified. Then I have the Enigma Effect coming out, as mentioned, and then I have a book called The Book of the Seven Spells, which is the first in a middle grade trilogy. So, the target audience for that sort of 4th through 8th grade. I spent about a decade writing mostly plays for children, and I really missed writing for children, so that's why I decided I want to do the middle grade book. And then I'm working on a book now that may or may not be a book. I've got about 10,000 words on paper, and you just never know until you've got a little bit more than that, whether it's going to reach critical mass, whether there's something there. So,
great. We have a question that's come in that we think is from one of your classmates. How did your experience in your extracurricular life at Davidson influence your life so far?
Well, gigantically. I mean, I was a theater major, so some of my love of the theater and my becoming a playwright could be attributed to my major, but a huge amount of my involvement in theater at Davidson was extracurricular. And a huge amount of, and I was also involved in performance in other ways. The aforementioned Eric Christensen taught me how to run lights in the 900 room and sound, and I applied for a job at a summer theater where I ended up building sets, which I was still trying to learn how to do, but I applied based on the fact that Eric had taught me how to do lights and sound. And I have now been married for 27 years to a woman I met at that summer theater. So I would say that affected my life in a pretty big way. I think the fact that extracurriculars at Davidson, I was a chairman of one of the student activities committees, and then I was the president of the student activities board. I worked really closely with C. Shaw Smith, after whom this room is named, and with William Brown, who was instrumental in creating this incarnation of the 900 room. That was all extracurricular, and every time I sit on a board, every time I interact with people professionally, I fall back on things that I learned there. So, I mean, there's almost no aspect of my life now that is not touched by my extracurriculars at Davidson, probably even more so than my academic life at Davidson.
How would you say the academic life at Davidson has impacted where you are today?
Well, I mean, certainly my work with Rupert Barber and Joe Gardner in the theater department was a gigantic influence in both just my love of theater as something that has enriched my life every year except the most recent one, and then in my professional involvement in the theater as well. Yeah.
Great. Your classmates are now chiming in, and I am supposed to tell you, beware the Ides of March in the library.
Okay, well, this is more, performing arts at Davidson. Back in the day, we were in an eating house called ATO. This was not a fraternity, Alpha Tau Omega. This was just our eating house. And I think it was fair to say that we were perhaps some of the more, what they now call creatives, on the Davidson campus. And on the Ides of March, every year we would reenact the assassination of Julius Caesar in the library of the in the EH Little Library, where there's sort of a marble floor when you first go in. And the part I always remembered is we did a thing where the assassins would we used butter knives from the eating house. The assassins would all drop their knives on the floor at the same time. There'd be this big clattering noise, but we used Shakespeare's script. And so yeah, Shakespeare has been a part of my life, both in performance, as an audience member, and in parody from Davidson right the way through. 2 or 3 of my children's plays for children are parodies of Shakespeare plays, and that goes right back to the Ides of March in the EH Little Library, back in the day. So.
That's great. This is our last question. You've told us about your new books, but what other projects are you involved in? I know you have your podcast.
Sure.
Yeah, we want to support you. So
I have
how
a
can we do
podcast
that?
called Inside the Writer's Studio, which you can find on most major podcast platforms. I started it about 4 years ago because I felt like a lot of the times when I was getting interviewed, I was being asked the same questions over and over and over again because I didn't have great Davidson graduates, creating the questions. And I wanted to interview authors in more depth than they usually get in a journalistic interview. So we do about 45-minute interviews. I had new novelists. I've had Ian McEwan and John Grisham and Louise Penny, and I've had people that you've never heard of. And it's just been a really great way to be part of that community. And then I'm also really involved with an organization in Winston-Salem called Bookmarks, which is a literary nonprofit. I helped them to open and establish an independent bookstore in downtown Winston-Salem. We have a major book festival every September, except for September 2020. But we're coming back this year. So on the 25th of September, come to Winston-Salem and come to the book festival. We'll have 45 or 50 authors in person. And then I'm doing a virtual panel too with some mystery writers. And so we'll have both virtual and in-person events for that festival. Should be great.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Charlie, for coming back and being here and sharing this experience with us. I know that our readers have really enjoyed getting to hear from you, and we really appreciate you doing this for us.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure.
So to our audience, just a reminder that we will have a recording of this event available on our YouTube channel in the next week. So you can be on the lookout for an email from our office with a link to the YouTube channel. And that is it for tonight. We thank you so much for joining us. It's always a great day to be a Wildcat. Good night, everybody.
Good night.